You know that saying, ignorance is bliss? I lived by it for years. My wife, Diane, adored her tropical getaways. She'd pack her bags twice a year, sometimes 3, jetting off to places where the water was bluer than the sky and the drinks never stopped flowing. It started as a girl's tradition with her best friend, Katie, something they cooked up back when we were all still stupid kids convinced that youth was infinite and heartache was something that only happened to other people. I didn't mind. I had my own baby to nurture, a business I'd built from the ground up. An empire of spreadsheets and late-night takeout, where the sound of a ringing phone was the sweetest music I knew. Sure, maybe I was obsessive. But it was my obsession, and I was good at it. You don't just leave your newborn company to fend for itself while you go chasing sunsets. So Diane went on her adventures without me. I loved her. I trusted her. And I told myself trust meant freedom. Or maybe it was just convenient for me to believe that while I was buried in work. She'd send me pictures, her grinning with a margarita in hand, her legs stretched out on some sun-bleached shore, Katie hamming it up in the background like a drunk tourist parody. And I'd smile, send her a thumbs-up emoji, and get back to contracts and payrolls. If I'm honest, I kind of liked that Diane had her own life. Independence was part of her charm. We were supposed to be the modern couple, the type who didn't cling to each other like life rafts. When she was home, we had our routines, our jokes, our lazy Sundays spent tangled up in blankets with coffee and terrible reality TV. She was affectionate, attentive. Always quick to rub my shoulders when I'd stumble out of the office looking like I'd just crawled out of a cave. So I had no reason to doubt her. None at all. The trips got longer, but I wrote that off as her finally cutting loose after years of keeping herself on a tight leash. We met young. Married younger. I always felt like she was missing out on something by tying herself to me so early. And maybe I was proud of myself for letting her live her own life. Letting her breathe. I told myself it was generosity. Maybe it was arrogance. Diane finally came home after 2 full weeks, her arrival announced by the rumble of Katie's Jeep in the driveway. I watched from the upstairs office window as she climbed out, her skin bronzed, hair lighter from too much sun, and her smile a little too wide. Katie blew her a kiss and peeled off down the street before Diane even reached the front door. I made my way downstairs, feeling foolish for how eager I was to see her. The house had felt strangely hollow without her, the silence too sharp. She dropped her bags by the entrance and launched herself into my arms with the enthusiasm of someone who'd been gone for months instead of a couple of weeks. She smelled of coconut oil and salt air, and her laughter was the same as ever. Maybe I was the one who changed. I kissed her, held her close, and tried to ignore the way my stomach twisted with relief. We spent the rest of the evening just catching up. She recounted the beachside resorts, the overpriced cocktails, the endless parade of vendors hawking handmade jewelry and parasailing excursions. She showed me pictures on her phone, her and Katie lounging under umbrellas, swimming in turquoise waters, mugging for the camera with fruity drinks in hand. It all looked picturesque and exactly as I imagined. Maybe the twinge of suspicion in my chest was nothing more than paranoia, something my overworked brain had concocted to keep itself entertained during her absence. I was ready to let it go, to chalk it all up to my own insecurities. But then Diane launched into a story about Katie and her Bahamian escapade. Diane had a way of spinning a tale, her voice rising and falling like a practiced storyteller's. According to her, Katie had stumbled into some wild adventure, the kind that made Diane laugh until tears sprang to her eyes. Katie had met a man down there, a local who worked as a diving instructor or something. Young, athletic, the kind of guy who spent more time on the beach than off it. Diane described him as if he were some mythological figure, bronzed skin, lean build, all confidence and charm. She even showed me a photo of him posing beside Katie at a beach bar, his arms slung around her shoulders like they'd known each other for years. Katie looked flushed and radiant, eyes glittering with something that went beyond the effects of alcohol. Apparently, Katie's encounter with the guy started out innocent enough. She'd gone snorkeling with him as part of some guided tour, but afterward, he'd invited her to grab drinks at a place only the locals knew about. One drink turned into several, and before she knew it, they were laughing like old friends. Katie had been giddy about the whole thing, Diane said, her words tumbling out with the same kind of gleeful disbelief you'd expect from someone recounting a near-miss car accident. It was all part of the vacation vibe, Diane explained, a harmless flirtation that gave Katie a break from her usual life. But the way Diane described the rest of the story made me uneasy. She said Katie had confessed one night, half drunk and sprawled across their hotel room bed, that she'd gone further than just flirting. That she'd crossed a line. Diane delivered the confession like it was part of the punchline, her eyes crinkling with amusement at her friend's audacity. According to her, Katie had justified it by saying she was stuck in a rut at home, her husband being too wrapped up in his own world to notice her slipping away. The guy from the beach had been exciting, spontaneous, everything her regular life lacked. Diane laughed it off, the way you'd laugh at someone who'd blown their diet by binging on ice cream for a weekend. As if it were some minor transgression, a bit of harmless fun that could be forgotten once the plane touched back down on American soil. I tried to smile along, but something about the story twisted in my gut like a blade. Diane had never made a big deal about other people's affairs before. She was loyal, sure, but she never felt the need to police her friend's morality. I wondered if it was something she picked up from Katie or if the atmosphere of that island had loosened her own boundaries. But I didn't press her about it. I just listened, nodding where appropriate, trying to keep my expression neutral. Diane had always been one to share her secrets, to unload every little detail of her day like a child emptying their pockets to show off shiny stones. It was one of the things I loved about her, that openness, the way she never seemed to feel the need to hide anything. And even if the story about Katie made me uncomfortable, I told myself it had nothing to do with us. It was someone else's drama, someone else's poor decision-making. I told myself not to judge Katie too harshly. Everyone makes mistakes. And if she decided to air out her dirty laundry to Diane, then fine. I wasn't about to go playing marriage counselor for someone else. Diane didn't ask me to keep it a secret, but there was something about the way she presented the whole thing that felt almost calculated. As if she was testing my reaction. I decided not to think about it too much. Katie had messed up. That was her business. If her husband ever found out, that would be his burden to carry, not mine. So I let it go. Or at least, I tried to. But the story lingered in the back of my mind, a shadow that wouldn't quite dissipate. It was like a splinter just beneath the skin, small enough to ignore most of the time but sharp enough to make itself known whenever I accidentally brushed against it. The days drifted by, Diane settling back into her usual routines, the house filling once again with her laughter and her perfume. Everything seemed normal. But there was a part of me that couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. Maybe it was just Katie's recklessness tainting the air, making me question things that didn't need questioning. Or maybe it was something worse. Something I couldn't yet bring myself to acknowledge. 2 months later, Diane was itching to get away again. I should have seen it coming, the way she started bringing up Katie's name more and more often, like a nervous tick. Katie this, Katie that, how Katie was having such a hard time at home, how her husband had become more distant and controlling, how she needed a break to clear her head. It was all laid out like the setup to a joke I couldn't quite see coming. When Diane finally told me what was on her mind, she made it sound like some ridiculous, too good to refuse offer. Katie, in her desperate attempt to keep her little secret from imploding, had apparently dangled the ultimate carrot in front of Diane's nose. A 2-week trip to Bali, all expenses paid, plus $2,000 in cash just to make sure the lie held together. I remembered Diane's face when she told me about it, that sparkle in her eye like she'd been handed the keys to some forbidden kingdom. It was Katie's idea, Diane explained, her voice laced with half-feigned disbelief at her friend's audacity. Katie needed another cover story, something airtight, something that would hold up under the kind of scrutiny her husband had apparently started throwing her way. Bali was a good distraction, Diane said. Katie's husband wouldn't expect her to be gone so soon after their last escapade, but if Diane went along, it would sell the story. A Girl's Trip, Part 2. This time with a bigger budget and better scenery. Katie would meet her boyfriend somewhere along the way, of course, but the details of that arrangement weren't my concern. Diane framed it all like some harmless scheme, a chance to help her friend while enjoying a lavish vacation on someone else's dime. And the way she pitched it, the whole thing did sound absurdly convenient. I should have questioned it more. But the way Diane spun the story, it felt almost comical, like some sitcom subplot where the characters try to juggle lies until they inevitably collapse. Diane had already made up her mind, that much was clear. She painted it like she was doing Katie a favor, as if her loyalty was worth the risk of getting caught. But there was something else, too, something she didn't say out loud but I could see it in her eyes. It was the thrill. The exhilaration of being part of someone else's mess, the satisfaction of getting away with something outrageous. Diane had always craved excitement in a way I couldn't quite keep up with. I let her go. I even laughed about it, about how ridiculous the whole setup was. I told myself there was nothing wrong with it, that it was just another one of Diane's crazy adventures. And $2,000 wasn't something to scoff at. That kind of money could cover a few bills, or at the very least, soften the blow of her absence. My business was doing fine, better than fine actually, but the thought of a little extra cash never hurt. Diane framed it like a win-win, and I chose to believe her. Because why wouldn't I? Trust was supposed to be the backbone of our marriage, the unshakable foundation we'd built everything on. She left a week later, boarding a flight with Katie that I'd booked myself, paid for by Katie's generous bribe. Diane had been giddy with excitement, her bags packed days in advance, her phone buzzing constantly with messages from Katie as they coordinated their schedules. She even joked about how she'd have to put up with Katie's whining about jet lag and overpriced cocktails. I played along, smiling and nodding, pretending I was completely at ease with the situation. Maybe I was. Maybe I'd convinced myself so thoroughly that I actually believed it. It was about a week after Diane got back from Bali that I received the letter. It was a plain white envelope, no return address, just my name written neatly across the front in blocky, controlled handwriting. At first I thought it was some generic business correspondence, maybe a thank you note from a client or a delayed invitation to one of those charity galas Diane always tried to drag me to. I tossed it on the counter and went back to making coffee. But curiosity has its own rhythm, and an hour later I was peeling it open with a butter knife and scanning the contents. The first sentence caught my attention in a way few things ever have. It read, "Malcolm, I know this may come as a surprise, but I believe your wife and mine have been hiding something from us." It was signed by a man named David, Katie's husband. We'd met in passing a handful of times over the years, mostly at neighborhood events or mutual birthdays, but I'd never had a real conversation with him. He struck me as the quiet type, polite but reserved, someone who listened more than he spoke. The letter asked me to meet him at a small cafe on the edge of town, nothing formal, just a chat over coffee. I wasn't sure what to expect, but something about the tone of the note stirred a low hum of unease in my chest. I arrived a few minutes early and found David already seated near the window, his fingers wrapped around a chipped mug, eyes scanning the parking lot like he was waiting for someone to chase him down. He stood when he saw me, shook my hand firmly, then motioned for me to sit. We skipped the small talk. David got straight to the point. He said Katie had returned from Bali acting off, distant, like her mind was somewhere else entirely. She'd mentioned a story during a phone call with one of her sisters, something about a woman on vacation who had covered for her friend's affair by pretending they were traveling together. At first, David hadn't thought much of it. But something about the way Katie spoke, the details she let slip, the way she laughed nervously, it didn't sit right. Then she made the mistake of repeating the story in casual conversation a few nights later, slightly changed, but with the same bones. He told me it didn't sound like some random anecdote. It sounded personal. When he confronted her, she brushed it off as something she read online. But David knew her well enough to tell when she was lying. That was when I leaned back in my chair and told him I'd heard that same story. Word for word. Only it hadn't come from Katie. It had come from Diane. And she wasn't talking about someone she read about online. She was talking about Katie. She was the one covering the tracks. We sat there in silence for a moment, the air between us thick with the kind of realization that changes everything. We both stared out the window, watching strangers pass by, pretending like our lives hadn't just been twisted into something unfamiliar. Then David said we should find out the truth for ourselves. Not just guess, not accuse, not throw words around like confetti hoping they'd stick. We needed evidence. Cold, undeniable proof. So we made a plan. David said Katie had been talking about another trip, something vague about needing to decompress again after the stress of work and family. Diane had mentioned something similar in passing, how they were considering a short getaway before the holidays. Something low-key, maybe just a few days in Mexico or Costa Rica. It was all very non-committal, but there was a tone in her voice that I hadn't heard in years. That subtle hum of excitement, like she was waiting for someone to give her permission to run. David pulled a few strings and managed to access Katie's email. Nothing invasive, just enough to see that there were flight confirmations sent to her inbox under a different name. A shared reservation. 2 tickets. No mention of Diane, but the timeline matched exactly with the one Diane had casually dropped during dinner a few nights before. The pieces were falling into place. We tracked the flight details, found the hotel where they'd be staying, and booked rooms of our own at a nearby resort. We kept everything quiet. I told Diane I had a business retreat. David claimed he was going on a hiking trip with some coworkers. We both packed light and flew out 2 days before the girls' scheduled departure. It was a coastal town, sleepy during the day, pulsing with life at night. We checked into our hotel and spent the first day scouting the area, familiarizing ourselves with the terrain. The hotel the girls had booked was only a few blocks away, an all-inclusive beachside paradise with private bungalows and cocktail bars open 24 hours. On the afternoon of their arrival, we watched from across the street as Diane and Katie climbed out of a cab, both wearing sunglasses and wide-brimmed hats, laughing like they hadn't a care in the world. But they weren't alone. 2 young men followed them out of the cab, each carrying a small duffel bag. They looked mid-20s, lean and tanned, the kind of men who exist only on travel brochures and gym posters. One of them slapped Katie on the backside playfully as they walked toward the hotel entrance. David's knuckles went white around the steering wheel. I just stared, not really surprised anymore, but still hollowed out by the sight. It wasn't just the betrayal. It was the way they moved, so familiar with these strangers, like this wasn't their first rendezvous. Like they had routines. We waited until nightfall before making our next move. Using a pair of borrowed hotel uniforms David had managed to get through a local contact, we slipped into the hotel unnoticed. We made our way down the halls, past couples lounging in robes, past housekeepers pushing carts, until we reached their wing. We didn't confront them. Not yet. That wasn't the plan. We needed something better. Something more lasting. We left small recording devices near the doorways, synced to our phones. We wanted to know who came and went, what was said, what was done. We wanted to strip away the illusion, piece by piece. But even that wasn't the endgame. David had something more elaborate in mind, a kind of quiet revenge that didn't involve shouting or slamming doors. He wanted to destroy the story they'd told themselves. Not just expose it, but twist it. Make them question who had the upper hand. And I had a plan too. One I hadn't yet shared with him. One that required a little more patience. Because sometimes the most satisfying revenge doesn't come in the heat of the moment. It comes when they think they've gotten away with everything. When they've let their guard down. When they come home thinking the worst is behind them. That's when you strike. But I kept that part to myself. For now. Revenge, the good kind, the kind you savor like a perfectly aged scotch, doesn't come from screaming in hotel lobbies or public confrontations. No, it comes from silence, from strategy, from letting your enemy walk straight into a trap while they're too distracted by their own lies to notice. David and I spent the rest of that week building our plan in the quiet hours of early morning, while the world around us dozed under fans and the sound of waves. We listened to the recordings. We watched the hotel's public cameras from a connection David had finagled through a tech-savvy cousin. What we saw was worse than what we imagined. Diane and Katie weren't just having flings, they were living entire second lives. Different names, different routines. They had inside jokes with the boys. They talked about us in the abstract, like ex-husbands they hadn't technically divorced yet. And the worst part? They looked happy. That hit harder than I care to admit. So we began phase 1, confirmation and collection. David called an old friend of his who ran a digital forensics firm. Within hours, we had the boys' real names, their social media, and a pretty detailed idea of who they were. One was a bartender from Cancun who traveled with clients. The other was a personal trainer/wandering adventurer type who lived out of a duffel bag and had a suspicious number of posts tagged in tropical resorts with middle-aged women. Diane and Katie hadn't just found these guys by accident. They'd been planning this. It wasn't a slip, it was a system. With every new bit of information, I felt the cold hard edge of what had to be done. And that's when the second phase took shape. The moment I saw Diane whispering to the bartender on the beach, laughing like she was 20 again and never married, I knew what our move had to be. We weren't going to drag them into the light. We were going to let them bury themselves in it. David agreed. If we were going to take back control, we had to do it with a scalpel, not a hammer. We waited until their final night. They were scheduled to fly out the next morning, and from the sound of their conversations, yes, we had their room bugged too, they planned to have one last celebratory dinner with the boys before heading back to reality. So we rented a private dining room in the same hotel. David tipped a waiter heavily to ensure Diane and Katie were seated at the table beside the large windows that faced into our space. They couldn't see us, but we had full view of them. We watched as they arrived, arm in arm with their younger companions, all dressed up like it was prom night. The wine flowed. The laughter was constant. They kissed them like teenagers. And that's when David made his move. He sent Katie a message from a fake account, one that looked like it belonged to a woman in their neighborhood. The message contained a few blurry photos of her and the boy, followed by a question, "Does your husband know you're here with your nephew's friend?" The color drained from her face the moment she saw it. She kept glancing around like the walls were closing in. Diane leaned over, trying to see the message, her smile fading fast. Moments later, I sent Diane a similar message from another anonymous account, so Bali wasn't enough. Interesting choice of company for a girls' trip. Hope Malcolm enjoys the photos. Diane stiffened, eyes darting toward the door like she expected to see me storming in. But I didn't. That was never the point. Instead, while they panicked, while they tried to calm their boy toys and find excuses to leave early, David had already hit phase 3. Earlier that day, he'd scheduled a mass email to go out to a select group of family members, mutual friends, and co-workers. The email included a link to a private folder, password protected, containing all the evidence, photos, recordings, even copies of the fake names used on the hotel bookings. It was worded delicately, framed as concern over the health of his marriage and a desire to be transparent before making any final decisions. There was no accusation, just a breadcrumb trail of facts. I had done the same. My email was sent to Diane's parents, her sister, and yes, even the couple we used to vacation with every summer. We didn't include everything. Just enough to fracture the image. To make people ask questions. To let Diane and Katie spend the next several months in a fog of explaining, denying, spinning half-truths that contradicted the ones before. We left the rest to rot in their silence. The beauty of it was that there was no single fire to put out. It was 1,000 small ones, smoldering across their lives. Not a clean break, but a slow unraveling. The next morning, we watched from a distance as the girls checked out. They looked exhausted. No makeup, no heels, just two women dragging suitcases heavier than when they arrived. The boys weren't with them. They must have been discarded sometime during the night, probably after the panic set in. David and I said nothing as we watched their cab pull away from the hotel. There was no satisfaction in it, not the kind you expect. Just a grim kind of peace. A stillness that came from finally acting on something that had festered for too long. But the story didn't end there. 2 weeks later, I came home from work to find a small envelope wedged in my mailbox. No return address, again. Inside was a photo. It was Diane, sitting alone in a cafe, her face tight with worry, staring at a phone on the table. The back of the photo was blank, except for a short message written in pen. "I know what you did.